Well, we have a great speaker today. He's been in the security industry for a long time. He's worked on some very notable projects like email system for the White House. He is a fan of mine. One of the first firewall products that I worked with was the Firewall Toolkit. Came on a floppy. Well, okay, I downloaded it from the internet and put it on a floppy. Great technology. Later on, started using the Gauntlet firewall. And those two things kind of changed my career path. In his spare time, he likes photography, firearms, and all kinds of other technology-related things. Please welcome Marcus Ranum. You can use the handheld.
Yeah, I'll grab this. Thank you. Thank you. You know, whenever somebody says you had an impact on my career early on, I don't know if I'm expected to apologize or cringe or what. Usually, to be honest with you, I just cringe. Let me just hook this thing up here. I'm going to give you some PowerPoints because that's kind of expected these days. Boom. Okay. Good. All right. So one of the things that a lot of security practitioners say is we need to talk to business people in their own language. And I used to wonder what that meant, and I used to say that sort of thing myself. And I finally realized that essentially if you're talking about something to business people and you want them to understand, you have to be able to talk in metrics, because that's what they're going to be able to use. As math is the language in which physicists can communicate, metrics are the language in which businesses communicate. And I think that's a thing we haven't done a very good job of mastering in the computer security community. And so I've been going around for the last couple of years trying to get people to think a little bit about how all of that works. And ultimately, the point of having some kind of a metric is to be able to convey the meaning of the things that you're observing happening in a way that is reasonably trustworthy and fairly clearly comprehensible, right? And that's, I think that our failure as a community to do a good job of embracing metrics and metrics-based communication is one of the reasons why the computer security community has frequently fallen back on relying on fear, uncertainty, and doubt, which is not, it's not as useful. I mean, if you can come in and tell somebody, I think you should do this for the following reasons, boom, 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 you're in better shape than if you come in and you go, wow, we're going to maybe appear on the front page of the New York Times or something like that. So here's what we're going to talk about. We'll talk a little bit about different kinds of metrics, what metrics are, why do you keep them, how do you establish them, how do you keep them relevant. One of the other things that comes up a lot whenever I'm talking about metrics, I'll get people to go, you should make sure you give me a list of all the metrics I should keep. Don't do that. I'll explain why in a second. Excuse me. Okay, there are lots of definitions for what a metric is. The one that I like to use is this one, which is a metric is some data and a means of reducing it to tell a story. And there's a lot of stuff hidden in this. I spent more time than I should have crafting this sentence, but the idea is that there's some data, but the data doesn't mean anything if all you have is the data and you don't have a way of reducing it into something that's going to be tangible, that's going to be usable. Then it doesn't really matter how much data you've got, which again is one of the reasons why I kind of giggle when people talk about big data, because the problem is if you've just got big data, you've got nothing. If you got I want big metric, right? Which is kind of what we're heading towards. And of course, if you've got big data, you can get big metric from your big data. The problem is you have to be able to reduce it into something that's going to allow you to tell a story. And that story is the part that's critical. That story is the place that makes the join between us computer security people and the businesses. So when we're saying the businesses don't understand us, The story is the thing we're telling them in order to get them to understand us. The metric is the number attached to that story to make them believe that the story is real. See how that works? I'll give you an example of a false metric. You've probably heard the old thing about 80% of attacks, or 80% of attacks are insider attacks. If you actually start trying to deconstruct that, I mean, I know the guy who pulled that number out of thin air at a conference back in 1993. I was there. That's a completely fictional number, and if you actually start decompiling it and figuring out where it came from, you'll realize that it's completely fictional, because then you get into epistemological questions like, what is an attack? 80% of attacks coming from the, what is an insight? How on earth did you actually measure that? And if you actually start challenging a metric when you see it coming up, you're going to realize that it's just a story. So another reason that I like to present and lead off with this definition is because the metric is some data and a means of reducing it to tell the story. If you start trying to decompile somebody else's metric, if all that you wind up left with is just the story, then they're probably lying to you. 95% of the time, if somebody just comes up and throws out a number as part of a story that's trying to influence you, and they can't decompile how they got that number and what that's based on, you can tell that they're just lying, like I was just when I said 95% of the time, right? So why would you keep metrics? There's a bunch of different reasons to keep metrics. First off, I got to admit, I got into it just because it's fun. John Thompson, Lord Kelvin said, "Is to measure is to know," which is a great way of putting it. And that kind of sunk in, and I sort of went, he's probably got a good point there. You really have a problem with making claims of knowledge unless you're able to bring some sort of measurements in. And if you can do that, that's absolutely fantastic. There's a bunch of other stuff that comes with this. You can show if you're succeeding. If you're intellectually honest, you may also show if you're failing, right? You could come in with the how badly we stink report is not really the report you want to produce, but if that's the report that you wind up with, that's the report that you're producing. Of course, justifying your existence in your budget, which is tied closely to the first one of those points, or to argue for change, which is usually the reason why you're going to want to keep some kind of metrics. You can also keep defensive metrics. In fact, one of the things I'm going to sort of suggest to you, if you want to get more into metrics and to understand metrics better, one of the things you might want to do as an assignment is to generate some kind of useful metric about something to do with your security process once a month, and just carry it around in your back pocket like a little loaded trip bomb, waiting for somebody to say something that is relevant to your metric, and then you can go, well, here, boom. Actually, we measure that in the security team. We measure that, and here's some numbers, right? I've seen this used to great effect in performance wars. I've got a friend who does this one all the time. So he'll come along and he'll say, we need to turn on all the logging and stuff and all the load balancers because that's going to be potentially useful in the event of a breach. And the network guys go, it'll slow the load balancers down. And then he could say, well, actually, here's where we did performance testing on a load balancer and turned the logging on, and we weren't able to measure any difference, right? And you just throw out that number. Obviously, you need some numbers to show that there wasn't any difference. So you'd want some numbers that say this is the bandwidth and bandwidth utilization we could get through the load balancer plus latency increase, and it hasn't changed. Sorry, game over, right? When you're the person in the meeting who actually has metrics that are relevant to the topic, it's good that they be relevant to the topic if you can arrange that. But if you're the person who's got relevant metrics, you're the person with the gun at a knife fight, right? Which is, a good thing. So here's an example of a metric. One of the problems is we tend to engage in a little bit of scientism when it comes to metrics. We want to think metrics are more powerful and are more important and are more significant than they are. And so I wanted to start off by talking about this using a metric that it's not really very good, but it's a very important metric. It's probably a very important metric simply because it really isn't good. Does anyone know how the poverty rate was, how that came about? See? So here's a problem, right? If we were going to actually have a meaningful scientific sort of meta discussion about poverty rate, you would have to understand what how the poverty rate was calculated and what that means, because there's a lot of stuff hidden inside that if you start to unpack it. So here's what happened. There was a woman at the Department of Agriculture who found out what the caloric intake for a working class person who had a manual job was. So, you know, per week. So you've got, you know, Fred the bricklayer burns 3,200 calories per day. So Fred the bricklayer needs so many calories per week. And then what she did is she went to the store and she priced what it would cost to purchase those kinds of calories in line with the FDA's kind of food triangle idea. So if Fred the bricklayer was going to, you know, not subsist on beer, which is relatively expensive, but Fred's going to subsist on on beans, how much does it cost? And then, based on coming up with that cost number, then everybody who couldn't afford basic sustenance was below the poverty line, and everybody who could was above it. That's pretty cool, all right? But if you think about it, there's some wags piled on top of wags and then some fudge factors thrown in for decoration in that. It's not really a very good metric. Now, what happened is she came out with this during the middle of the Depression, and suddenly it became incredibly relevant. And it became relevant, and what's interesting about this particular metric is that it has changed profoundly since she first established it. The way it's calculated has been changed. It's now scaled for inflation. That's a good idea, right? Scaled for inflation, but you know, nobody, if we were trying to do this right, they would have scaled the whole underlying practice based on the fact that food has gotten dramatically more expensive. They don't do that. So the point I'm trying to make about this very, very interesting metric, which has a serious political effect on the country. People take this metric quite seriously. It shows up in election campaigns and stuff like that. This metric is just it's a complete fudge. Sorry. If you wind up producing a metric for your organization that is good, that may happen to you. The actual way that this metric has been calculated has changed more or less constantly. It's always being changed, even if only that it's being scaled for inflation and not scaled for the decrease in certain types of, you know, food costs, right? Again, remember, most people nowadays do not cook their own beans. They just don't do that. They, you know, nowadays, if you were trying to come up with a poverty line calculation, you'd have to see, you know, how much is a reasonable caloric impact, and then how much does it cost how much does that cost at McDonald's or Burger King or, you know, whatever, and then work forward from there. You know, so you could call it, you know, base it on nachos or something like that. All right. So how do you establish metrics? The first thing in establishing metrics is do not ask your boss. I really mean this. Do not ask your boss. Because, think back to our original premise here. If what we're trying to do is figure out how to talk to businesses, and you go to your boss and you say, what metrics should I keep? You've just said, I don't know anything about my job. In fact, I don't know why I'm here. Because if you do know why you're here, you should be able to answer this question. And so if you go to an executive manager and say, what metrics should we be keeping about our security practice, you may have limited your career trajectory. Certainly if it's me, you definitely have. The only difference between me and most other executives is that I'll tell you. I'll say, well, you know, maybe you should not, you know, maybe you should abandon your hopes of being a strategic visionary. Don't ask your boss. Don't wait for SANS or OWASP or somebody to come out with the list of top 10 metrics that you should keep. That's the other one. Don't do that. If you read articles in the trade press that say, what are, you know, here are some good metrics to keep, that's probably not particularly useful unless those metrics tie to something that you actually do, right? So if you're in charge of vulnerabilities for an organization and you're trying to figure out whether your organization is doing a good job handling fixing software flaws that are critical to your systems and network in a timely manner, then having some vulnerability statistics is really, really useful. Back to the earlier point, having the statistics is just the data and the means of crunching them. It's up to you to tell the story. So let me just sort of trampoline off that and give you an example of what I mean. Let's say that you are responsible for maintaining, vulnerabilities across your organization. And what you might do is, and there's plenty of tools. The company I work for, we make those things. There's tools that do a great job of tracking vulnerabilities, tracking the closure rate, tracking the dwell time of vulnerabilities, stuff like that, right? So now you've got the data, you've got some means of reducing it at your fingertips. Now the question is, what's the story you're going to tell? And your executive management, if you're not in front of that freight train, if you're behind the freight train, you're in good shape. Sorry, if you're in front of the freight train and you're about to get crushed, somebody might come to you and say, what does all this mean? Right? What you really want to do is you want to be in front of you want to be driving the freight train. That's a terrible analogy, and I've got it stuck in my head now, and I can't get it out. But what you really actually want to do is you want to say, here we have a bunch of data, and what this shows is that the average amount of time that goes between when we identify a critical vulnerability in one of our internet-facing systems and we get it closed, the average time of that is 5 days. And then you can say, so that means we've got an exposure every time there's a new attack that gets published. We have an exposure of up to 5 days. See where I'm going with this, right? And you can say what we're actually measuring, and this is where you sink the hook. You can say what we're actually measuring with our vulnerability tracking program is not how vulnerable we are. We use that word. What we're measuring is how good our systems administrators are, right? That's another critical part about how to talk to executives. One of the things you'll notice when you're talking to the business people is that a good executive is really skilled at making their problems somebody else's problems. And so what I just did there is I just ice-picked the systems administrators over our vulnerability rate. But it's legit, or it could be legit. Right. Again, I'm a big fan of the sciences, and I think it's important to be honest about where your stuff comes from. So I might joke about kind of cooking a statistic here or there, but that's not something I would ever actually do. All right. We kind of talked about how the poverty line was established. So here's how you start to establish your metrics. Start with the question. Well, there's two different models for doing this. One is what I call the top-down, the other is the bottom-up. The bottom-up is you start with the questions, and then you start to figure out, can you answer those questions from the data that you've got? The top-down approach is the desperation model, where you go, what data have I got? And then you sit there and go, now, what can I do that's useful with this? They're both perfectly good. I think that starting with the question is more likely to answer the questions that you're actually interested in answering. Whether if you just simply start with the data, you're going to answer the questions you're able to answer. And those might not be the questions that you want, right? So the questions that you are going to want to answer are the ones where you can sit down. So how do you do this? You're going to have to do some business process analysis for what you do. What's your purpose? And that's why you should never go and ask your boss, what metrics should I keep? You're going to have to do that process analysis. Sit down with your team and say, hey, here's one of the things I'd like to do. I'm not doing this, I swear I'm not doing this because we're going to outsource you, but I'd like you to start tracking approximately what you spend your time doing every day so that you can tell us what you're doing. And I'm not doing this because I plan to outsource you, I swear. We're not going to replace you with a Perl script running in the cloud, really honest, I swear. But I might discover that I will need to do that. Because what we're going to do is we're going to learn where you spend your time. And that's going to allow you to take clock time across multiple employees and turn that into staffing resource allocation time. And that's particularly relevant to the business. So the reason this is important is like the scenario I was sort of waving earlier where the business units come in and they've got this idea that they want to do. They want to do something we're going to allow everybody to, I know, let's put a Java virtual machine on everybody's desktop. What could possibly go wrong with that? And the people in the security team go, oh God. Well, if you don't have any numbers, you're down to saying Java sucks, which is true, but you're just making this bald assertion. Now, if you have industry-wide numbers, if you've got a view and the scope of the impact of having Java virtual machines, you could actually say, well, here's vulnerability rates in an organization that doesn't have Java at all, and here's Java-related attacks that have succeeded against us, and we can start to come up with some kind of an extrapolation about how badly this is going to hit us. And then, because we know how much clearing each incident, running each time we run our incident response process, it takes so many hours and it costs so much money, right? And so we can say, if this business unit proposes to do this thing that could potentially double or triple our number of incident response times we have to turn the crank on our incident response process, I'm going to need 4 more people. And what you've just done there is you haven't come in and gone, no, we're going to get hacked, it's going to be bad. You've just come in and said, sure, that's fine. Here's the consequences of that. Here's some projected consequences of that decision. You make up your own mind. When you're talking to the business, when you're talking to the executives, that's the way to do it, mostly because they're arrogant bastards, but they think they know everything, and what they want is they want the information that allows them to make their Napoleonic brilliant decisions, right? And of course, what we really know is that we manipulate them by giving them the information that we want them to have. And then the other part of the trick is that they know that we're doing that. So it's this consensual dance. But if we security practitioners aren't playing that game, it's the guys from the business who are driving that process. And I call this the battle of 2 narratives. So you've got some guy in some business unit in your organization, and he's reading the Seat Back magazine on United Airlines, and it says, here's this company that saved $400,000 by moving to the cloud. And he comes back and says, we should move to the cloud. And now he's floating this narrative that there's going to be big savings by moving to the cloud, right? That's his lie, but he's told that lie. And now you have to respond. And as the security practitioner, you have a couple of options. One is get your name out on monster.com and find another job. Two is to respond with a lie of your own, which is what we usually do, right? That's why we rely on fear, uncertainty, and doubt too much. So they come in, they go, we're going to save $10 million if we move everything to the cloud. And you go, no, but we'll get hacked and all our information will leak. Now the executive who's listening to this here's one guy, and he's talking about making $10 million, and this other guy is just whinging about some stuff. Guess whose opinion carries more weight always in that circumstance? So you have to be able to respond and say, yeah, that sounds great. Other organizations that have done this have had to shift and reallocate a lot of parts of their process. And so we can compare our expected results to his expected results, and we just have to acknowledge that the governance costs of moving this stuff to the cloud are going to be interesting, and we have to factor those into the cost savings projections. That's the nice way of doing it. Here's the not nice way of doing it. The not nice way of doing it is when that person says we're going to save $10 million if we move to the cloud, is you pull out a piece of paper and you write, on this date, Joe said we're going to save $10 million if we move to the cloud. And then you say, that's a great idea. I am behind you all the way. This is absolutely fantastic. Here's what we should do. We should do a limited proof of concept. We should move 1/10 of everything to the cloud, and we'll see if you save $1 million, and we'll have a review in a year, and we'll see if those cost savings materialize. What you've just done is ice pick Joe. You can now walk him around like a puppet on that ice pick for the rest of his career, and here's the best part of it. If those cost savings actually do materialize, which never has happened yet, but it might happen, if those cost savings do materialize, then you can go, see, I was right. I was behind you all the way. I was your first supporter, Joe. But most likely what you're going to find is there's going to be substantial cost overruns because everything is always a little bit more difficult than those optimists think that it's going to be. So the way that you can, if you're being honest, the way that you can provide a note of reality into these kinds of optimistic projections is to come in with some projections of your own and say, I thought about that, and I think we can make this work. We're going to have to reallocate things, right? We're going to be doing less systems administration, which means that we're going to have to let the systems administration team go. Notice how you just reduced somebody somebody else's staff there. We're going to have to let the systems administration, we'll let a bunch of those guys go, but we're going to need to start thinking about, we're going to start thinking more about governance issues and stuff like that than we're doing, and maybe we're going to need to figure out some sort of a framework for figuring where our data actually is and all that kind of stuff. Okay, so start with the question, do the process analysis. What you want to do is think of it as wickets. I like to think of it as visually mental. This is weird, I realize, but mentally I see it as kind of a croquet game. You got to go through these little wickets. And so you look at your process and you figure out which of the little wickets you go through in the course of doing everything. And then you want to measure clock time and resource time as you go through each one of those wickets. So from when you go to from A to B, does it take you 1 hour of 6 employees, or does it take you 6 hours of 1 employee? And what you're doing there is you're measuring the parallelism, the innate parallelism of the problem. Because one of the things that could happen when you start trying to squeeze out extra efficiencies is you might find that that's a problem that doesn't parallelize well, and you're going to have to actually have deeper expertise than broader expertise. So do some process analysis, figure out where your people spend most of their time. And those are the places where you can start trying to figure out where you need to improve things more. One of the other things you might find is that your process has a gap in it. Let's say that your process looks like this. We're doing vulnerability management, and so we run a scan, we identify a vulnerability, we tell systems that they need to fix it, and then we wait for them to fix it, and then it gets fixed, and then we clear it from our thing. Right? What you can do in that situation is you can now start to measure how long it takes systems to get through that wicket as well. So what you're doing is you're measuring not only your practice and your process, you're measuring the practice and process effectiveness of other practices that impact on yours. Let me put that in a more negative way because I'm just such a cynical person. What you're doing is you're measuring whether the problem is your vulnerability management process or whether it's your systems administrators. All right? Because then, and then you can be really, really dry about it. Right? You can do a presentation. You can say, here's our vulnerability management process. And here's the different units in which, here's the different components of that process where we spend our time. Oh, yeah, this big, gigantic green bar here is green because that's our systems administrators and I don't control them. And you can sink the hook by saying, in fact, we actually spend a total of about an hour on each vulnerability, and it's our systems guys that spend 3 weeks. Right? Yeah. I'm afraid I'm probably raising your blood cynicism level a little bit. I used to be CEO of a startup, and so I had to learn some of these tricks, and I had to deal with them. In fact, just for free, since you're here, I'll throw out another one that's not really relevant to metrics, but it's good for you guys all to know because someday it may be used against you. Here's a great trick. When you see senior executives pull this trick, you know you're dealing with a political manipulator. That may not be bad, but that's what you're dealing with. So here's what happens. Let's say you've got the new CEO, and the new CEO comes in. Here's what happens. The new CEO comes in and spends a couple of days looking around, and then quietly, they won't tell you that they did this, quietly, they send an email or a letter to the board, it says the board of directors, and they say, when I agreed to take this job, I didn't realize what a mess this place is. I didn't realize that, vulnerabilities are all over the place, the software's quality is terrible, our customers more or less hate the product, but I think I can turn it around. So you see what happens there? He's set himself up, so if things actually don't suck as badly as he just sold them, he's going to look good. Because they think now that he came in and was disappointed and started to turn it around. If things actually do suck, he's the genius who walked in and noticed right away that things were bad and tried to turn it around and failed. If you see someone pull that, be very, very afraid. Okay, so back to what I'm here to talk about. Look at your process and make a list of what's quantifiable. And that's usually going to be staff time, but it might be something else. This is where you step away from that, give me 10 metrics that mean something. If you make widgets, you might want to see if you can quantify your impact on widgets, right? If you work for Acme Widget, widgets may be your unit of measurement. It may be that your unit of measurement is web hits. It may be that your unit of measurement is emails sent, or it may be your unit of measurement is vulnerabilities cleared, or whatever, right? But you have to figure out what your units of measurement are in order to start measuring things. And then, you know, what kinds of quantities are you interested in? Are you interested in this thing going up? Are you interested in that thing going down? And that's one thing that is nice about metrics. They generally don't go up. They don't go sideways. They only go up or down, which is pretty good. Just a general rule for metrics when you're presenting something: don't mix things that go up as better on the same chart as things that go down as better, right? Our vulnerability rate's going up, and our budget's going down. No, wait, don't do that, right? You just always make bad news cluster together and good news cluster together. That's just a general rule of thumb. And then decide which is the good direction, up or down. The other question, which is a profound one, is how do you decide what constitutes a significant movement? My advice to you is don't do that. That's not your problem. What'll happen is the human eyeball figures out what constitutes a significant movement pretty much automatically. Like if I go back to this slide here, you can see there's a significant movement right around 1981. How did I know that? I don't know. My eye just picked it right out. And then measure and iterate. Another piece of advice about metrics: don't give people pie charts. Actually, I'm going to go back to this slide again. Okay. If you think about this slide, and you took this, and each one of those dots across the horizontal axis, each one of those is a pie chart. This slide is a rendering of 150 pie charts on a single page. When someone gives me a pie chart, I think they think I'm stupid, and I immediately hate them. Because what I'm doing is I'm going, you know, it's 1983 here, and so you just picked it at the point where it looks the worst or the most favorable for your particular agenda. I want to see the whole chart. And so if you go to some executives, or if you go to anybody who's been to one of my talks about this topic, and you give them a pie chart, you've just shot yourself in the foot. Also, pie charts are ugly, but that's just another whole issue. But here's a point about that. Anybody who is in working in a business job ought to be able to read that kind of time sequence chart. In fact, you really aren't a fully functioning human being in modern society if you can't read a time fluctuation chart, right? And that's another reason why, you know, pie charts are kind of insulting, because basically that's what it's saying. It's like you're so dumb, I'm going to treat you at about the intellectual level of a frog, because frogs can tell that there's much more green in this chart than there is blue. Oh, and by the way, our products do produce pie charts, I will say. If you want pie charts, you can have pie charts. But yeah, I actually tried to get that stopped, but our customers asked for pie charts, so they get pie charts. And then, you know, measure and iterate. Measuring and iterating is critical in being able to do this, because what happens is, over time, when you start keeping a metric, you will possibly change things. And if you change things, what you want to be able to do is you want to be able to note stuff. Imagine how cool this would be if this was a meeting and I was presenting to all of you guys about our vulnerability management process, and I went, here's our vulnerability management process, and the current rate of critical vulnerabilities, and here's what happened when we moved off Windows XP. Right? And it goes down. And then I can put on the chart, I can put a little arrow. Here's where we moved off Windows XP, right? What you've got is you've got data, you've got a means of reducing it, and it tells a story. It tells the story that it's a good thing we moved off Windows XP, or whatever it is that we were doing, right? Here's where we moved off Windows entirely, right? You can... Yeah. Sorry, I just dream. I'm not a total Apple fanboy. Actually, I hate Apple pretty much as everybody. Anyone in this room here who's familiar with Three Dead Trolls in a Baggie knows where I'm coming. Okay, Three Dead Trolls in a Baggie is a musical group of systems administrators who wrote the operating system song, and the refrain is "Every OS sucks," and that's kind of where I'm coming from. But anyway, all right. So how do you keep these things relevant? Don't change your algorithm constantly. So with the poverty line metric that I put up earlier, one of the things that they're doing is they're constantly scaling it, rescaling in order to keep it abreast of the changes in the underlying assumptions of what's going on. So you have to to do that. If you have to keep changing your algorithm, you're just making yourself an awful lot of work. So I guess a side corollary of that is don't do like that poor lady at the Department of Agriculture did, and just come up with a metric and publish it. As Ray Wiley Hubbard says, the most important thing about songwriting is when you write a song, you should ask yourself, can I play this song for 35 years? He's the guy who wrote Up Against the Wall, Redneck Mother, and he's been performing this song for 35 years on every encore. Think about that, right? You don't want that to be the issue. So think about whether or not your metric is one that you're going to be willing to keeping for 35 years. If you need to keep historical data where you're making a changeover or you're going to switch over to interpolating something or rescaled, if you're honest and fair, you should put a clear bar between what's collected and what's interpolated. That's something that people who are being manipulative with political statistics and metrics generally won't do. They'll, our debt is going to go like this, and they don't mention the fact that we're right here right now, and this is just a projection based on some cooked statistics, right? They don't generally tell you that. They show it, and then everybody gets all scared and everything like that. But here's a good example, which is if you're keeping transfer data, let's say for whatever reason you've decided that the amount of data transferred through the corporate website, well, it wasn't a website, the amount of FTP data that we pushed out to the world is some kind of an indicator of customer outreach. And then suddenly HTTP comes along, your chart shows that your FTP data just dropped through the floor, and then they fire you because obviously you're no longer needed. Right? You need to put new numbers on that chart as necessary, and it's always a good idea to put a little caption saying this is where the new change occurred that caused these things to happen. Okay. Don't tie your metrics to financial models. I mean, do it if you have to, but I would dodge that one if I possibly can. And the reason is if you're talking to the business, if you're talking to executives, they're going to do that for you. And that way they own that little mistake if they make it, right? So if you come and you say, we're going to talk about our vulnerability management process, and we think that if we revert back to Windows XP, it will triple the number of times we have to crank our vulnerability management, our incident response process may triple, which means that we're going to need 4 more FTEs to handle it. Don't say I'm going to need another $1 million worth of staff, all right? You're just going to need 4 more FTEs. They'll do the math and they'll figure out what 4 FTEs fully loaded is worth, and then they'll lay you off and replace you with a Perl script running in the cloud, because that right. So, but just focus on the staffing. If you start focusing on the money, you're just setting yourself up for that kind of cloud redeployment sort of thing. Another thing that can happen is occasionally you run into a metrics wonk who doesn't agree with you. I've kind of gotten to do this. It's like the land war in Asia scenario. You can just snipe at the person's numbers forever. Well, how'd you collect that? What's your assumption for this? How do you know your data sources are good? You can just keep doing all that kind of thing. So here's how you get around that. What you get is the buy-in on the algorithm first. So you say, well, if we were here in our security practice, we think that there's 2 things that are important that we do. One is we manage vulnerabilities by working with the systems team to get them fixed. And the other thing we do is we manage the incident response process, in which we work with the systems team to get things fixed, but we also do damage control before and we do damage control afterwards, damage management. Right? So these are the 2 things that we do. And does everybody agree with me? Right? And if everybody goes, well, yeah, that's what you do. Now I've sunk the hook so that I can come back and I can say, great, well, based on our projections, here's what it's going to look like if we continue to do things the way we're doing without changing them. If we're going to triple our desktops, we're going to triple our load unless we can do something to automate this, right? So get the buy-in on the underlying assumptions, and then you pop up your chart. Because otherwise what happens if you just pop the chart up and the chart terrifies everybody, there's going to be some not very intellectually honest person in the room who's going to say, I think there's a rounding error over there, or something like that. Usually that's me, but and then tie things to existing known facts wherever you possibly can. So you can extrapolate this, and the other thing you can do if you really want to defend yourself and terrorize others is you can put those facts on your chart. You can put a little legend at the bottom that says assumptions. I assume that a fully loaded admin costs this, or I'm assuming that, you know, I'm assuming that fixing a day zero patch takes our systems administrators this much time. So you put that on there. Here's another thing. Not enough people do this, including me. So this is the do as I say, not as I do slide. I've done a little bit of it, but there's only so much you can do. In computer security, because our job is kind of to defend everything, more or less, right? And we understand in computer security that the only way to really defend things effectively is to defend everything. You can't have undefended and defended systems sitting on the same network. It just doesn't work. So we are kind of culturated to try to boil the ocean every time. When you talk to most security practitioners, you say, I want to switch to two-factor authentication. Most security practitioners will say, our users would never go for that, right? What you really should say is, we're thinking about doing a limited proof of concept pilot on some of our systems administrators to switch them over to two-factor authentication. And then based on what we learn from that, we may do an enlarged rollout. See how I did that? First off, I made it someone else's problem and pain. They're the ones who are going to look bad if it doesn't succeed. And secondly, I now have separated demographics, because now what I can do is, in a year, I can come back with a chart and I can say, we switched our systems administrators to two-factor authentication and everybody else was not. Meanwhile, if you look at the number of credential-based compromises that we had none in our test group that was doing the two-factor, and we had 16 over here, which took us a combined total of 200 hours worth of hard work to clear up. See how that works? Right? And that's totally legit. So there's all kinds of things you can do. Whenever you're dealing with statistics, one of the most interesting and difficult problems of statistics is to figure out the buckets that you're going to put your data in. How are you going to cross-analyze your data? And so this is the place where anytime where you're collecting something, think about how you're going to bucket it, because you can always merge it together using magical addition technology. But breaking it apart, if you didn't keep it separated, is very, very difficult. So if you can collect, for example, vulnerabilities by business unit, that's much better than talking about just vulnerabilities. You can always talk about vulnerabilities total by adding up the vulnerabilities by business unit. But you know, back to what I was saying earlier about being able to figure out what the questions are that you want to answer. That's a great one, by the way. Alex Hutton, that's his favorite way of torturing security practitioners. He'll walk in and say, what's our riskiest business unit? How many of you think you could answer that? What's your riskiest business unit? One? Okay, see? I know somebody who did this study, and it was pretty cool, because they were looking at business units, and they discovered that they had a huge amount of susceptibility to phishing attacks in one particular business unit. Anybody know which one it was?
Executives.
What?
Executives.
Nope. Human resources. Because their job is to click on every attachment they get. Right? And so this guy basically went, oh, well, look at this. You know, we've got our pie chart of suck. And HR is this huge web, and we basically have concluded that if we give those guys iPads to read those attachments on, we're going to be able to take that vulnerability rate down by 80 to 90%, which means that we're going to be able to offload 25% of our total incident response throughput just by buying 4 iPads, and besides, they're going to like us because they get iPads now. Everyone else will hate them, but everybody hates HR anyway. All right, see how that works? So there's some stuff, and this is what I mean about do as I say, not as I do. If I was the ruler of computer security, which you guys can all be really thankful I'm not, but if I was the ruler of computer security, I would be doing stuff like this. I would be going to one organization and say, you are going to do classic antivirus. You're going to use one of those next generation malware things. You're going to run sandboxes on everything, and you're going to do application whitelist, and you're going to do that for a year. And during the course of that year, you're going to keep something about how much interaction you have to do with the system. And at the end of that year, I'm going to be able to come up and I'm going to be able to demonstrate differential outcomes among those groups, as well as differential administrative loads. And we might learn something, right? Instead, in the computer security world, instead of actually doing science and treating this as a demographic epidemiological problem, which is basically what it is, we go 80% of attacks come from the inside, or other completely bad BOGO numbers. Okay, I've kind of already talked about this. It's the battle of two narratives, where the person who's being the voice of optimism is always projecting big savings or something like that. And the only way to deal with this is to have some kinds of facts from metrics. The big place where this crops up is if security is ever recommending doing something that may or may not in any way, shape, or form impact network or system performance. The network guys always play that card first. It's the first card that they play. They go, no, it'll slow the firewall down, or it'll slow the load balancer down, right? And that's where you can go, well, actually, my friend at Warner Brothers has those F5 load balancers just like yours, and so I asked him to turn logging off on his for a couple of minutes and just tell me what the CPU load was, and then turn it back on, because he keeps full logging on. And so here's his chart of the performance impact of turning the logging on and off. And do you see anything on there? Right? That's over, right? This is exactly the weaponized version of what I was talking about earlier, where you stake your claim to the statistic and then you back it up with the number. Here, what you're doing is you're getting your opponent to stake the claim to the statistic with nothing to back it up, and then you come along and go wham, Not only have I shown that you're a liar, I've shown that you don't actually know how to do performance measurements. So that's really good. If you don't come with facts, your opponent controls the narrative. The other way of doing this, which again I don't recommend because I don't want to turn you all into horrible, cynical political manipulators, the other way of doing it is to simply understand that you're in a battle of narratives and that your opponent is trying to control the narrative, and be better at controlling the narrative than them. In which case that's just marketing and lying, but those are fairly effective techniques as well. Okay, so some critical recommendations, and we're almost done here. Establish a metrics process. Just get going. If I can be a little bit zen for a minute, there's the old saying, when is the right time to plant a mighty oak tree? 50 years ago, right? When is the time to start a metrics program? Well, about 2 years ago, maybe, something like that, in your past. How many of you do have a metrics program? Okay, that's pretty good. Yeah, that's pretty good. Is it working for you? Yeah? Okay, well, maybe a little bit. Okay, well, maybe you need to just metric better. Like I said, 90% of metrics are, useful. Examine your metrics. Start by collecting data that you've got, and then do a gap analysis between the data that you've got and the data that you want. And at the same time as you're doing that, start with the list of questions that you wish that you could answer, and then match that against the gap analysis of the data that you've got, and see if you can answer the questions that you've got with the data that you've got. If you can answer the questions that you have with the data that you've got, you win. That very seldom happens. Oh, yes, another point, back to the boil the ocean thing. So you do this process. You figure out the metrics that you want to start presenting about your practice. And let's say that you've got 10. And there's 3 of them that you're going to need more logging and some other stuff to be able to do those. Start with the 7 that you can do and generate something valuable with that. And while you're generating valuable stuff with that, then you can work on the other 3. Don't boil the ocean on metrics. If you do this right and you really think about it hard, you might be able to come up with just one metric that's the metric you can live and die based on. And if that's your metric, then fight it for all that you possibly can. Examine your business processes, ask yourself where they can be quantified and measured, and that's almost always at critical junctions. Pay special attention to spots where things trampoline into and out of your area of authority, because that's a place where you can measure how long the problem was somebody else's problem before it landed back in your lap. A more difficult case of a metric, let's say we've got a problem where we've got, it's part of our incident response flow, and we've got a problem where we do the first part where we triage it, and then it goes to systems, and then it goes to legal, and then it comes back to us. Now I don't know who's slow, whether it's systems or whether it's legal. So you know what I'm going to recommend, right? You go to the systems guys and say, we're having trouble with legal. We need to keep metrics on how badly they suck. And the systems guys will tell you how much time, when they give that data to legal. Then you go to the legal guys and say, we're having problems with the systems guys. We're trying to collect metrics to show how much they suck. And then you can see if it all adds up. And then you can come along with metrics that basically say, we're great and these guys stink. That's what you want to do. Don't go overboard with statistics. Statistics, you don't need to start worrying about Six Sigmas and standard deviations or anything like that. The kinds of stuff that we're talking about here with metrics is almost always going to be visually calculated running averages. What do I mean? You just put it on a time sequence chart and your eye is going to go, huh. Right? There's other things that you can do, but just having your eye go, oh, look, that bar's going down. You win, right? And I'm always a big fan of comparing metrics over absolutes. What I mean by that is mapping stuff to change rates, internal change rates. And the reason that that's kind of useful is because it may generalize out. So if I have an organization with 100,000 desktops and I've got 6,000 critical vulnerabilities in my 100,000 desktops at any given time, I can expose that number to you. But what I could do is I could say at any given time, 1 in 600 desktops has a critical vulnerability, right? And the reason that that's useful is that might actually be a useful number for some of you who don't have 100,000 machines. If you don't have 100,000 machines and I'm saying I've got 7,000 vulnerabilities in 100,000 machines, you're going to go, this totally does not apply to me. But if I say I've got 1 vulnerability in 500 machines, then that, it still does not apply. Right, we understand it still does not apply because your organization is different from mine. You may be doing different things. Your users may be incredibly stupid, whereas mine are brilliant. Right, but it depends. It depends what we do, but somebody else might still be able to use it. The other thing that's nice about that is it inherently normalizes your data. So if I work in banking and you work in banking, now you might assume that my banking users do the same kind of stuff as your banking users. You might buy that number a little bit harder than if I'm in the hospitality business and you're in banking and I'm talking about severity of vulnerabilities. You're kind of going, that doesn't really add up. We have a totally different problem. Of course, the answer is you don't really have a totally different problem, but it's convenient to think about that. Okay, so now just a couple random stuff. There's a great book by Darrell Huff called How to Lie with Statistics. Anybody here familiar with it? Yeah, 2 people. Okay. It was actually like the graduate statistics text when I was an undergrad. It was great. It's a beautiful little book. It's relatively inexpensive. It doesn't have a lot of fancy math. What it does is it shows all of the easy ways that you can produce psychologically distorting metrics. And if you read How to Lie with Statistics, you will never be able to watch mainstream television again without screaming and throwing things at your display, because all of those things on CNN, Fox, I don't care, MSNBC, I don't care what you think it is, all of their metrics are really horribly bad. And of course the thing is when you see a news outlet that's presenting metrics that are deliberately skewed, you know that they're not doing it because they're stupid. They're doing it because they want you to be terrified or buy something or whatever. So I highly recommend this book. In fact, I recommend this book generally so much that I make an offer that is a little bit weird, which is and I'll do it now, what the heck. Here's my offer. If you buy a copy of this book and you think that the book is worthless, send it to me and I will refund your money. I've never had anybody do that yet. But the point is, if somebody actually sends me a copy of Darrell Huff's book and says, I don't think it's worthwhile, they'll get my money because they need help. Another great thing if you're looking at metrics, I always look at this website anytime I'm producing a PowerPoint that's got something to do with metrics in it. GraphJam is basically just weaponized PowerPoint and metrics. And it's mostly silly stuff. My favorite one is actually the only legitimate pie chart that we can talk about, which is a pie chart. There's you know, a white wedge, and it's labeled pie I haven't eaten yet and pie I have eaten yet. You know, so that one works. That one actually really works. It tells the right story. But I highly recommend GraphJam. And also, if you're interested in metrics, this is one that's kind of fun. Take a look on the OkCupid blog. The guy, one of the guys who founded OkCupid, is a statistician. And that's kind of how he got interested in this whole idea of an online dating thing. And apparently one day he was bored and he realized, wait a minute, I have this gigantic pile of big data style data about millions of people's ideas of what their ideal romance and romantic behavior is. What can I find from this? And so he just does these great blog postings where he finds something and he plots it against something else. And there's really weird connections like this one here, which is if your partner is tweeting a lot, they're more likely to break up with you soon. So that was what I had to say. Those are inspirational sources, not particularly technical. Should I try to field any questions, or should I just run off? Okay. Are there any questions or comments? 90% of the time, nobody has questions about metrics. Yeah.
Okay. Are you particularly against Venn diagrams?
Am I particularly against Venn diagrams? Venn diagrams are interesting because they don't really say anything about the information. All they do is demonstrate the overlap. And a lot of the time when people draw Venn diagrams, what they're doing is they're trying to show something funny about the overlap of sets, and our eyes, which have been trained to deal with things in terms of size, will interpret that area based on that. I'm actually going to turn this back on. Make my point. Excuse me. Oh, come on. All right, what's going on here? The page up and page down buttons don't work unless you're, oh, come on, unless you're in this one. All right, here. So our mind, of course, we look at this and we go, oh, well, that's very clever, it's really funny, but we have just radically misestimated the size of Tic Tacs out of the entire candy and percussion instrument space. That should be less than a pixel, right? And it's the same problem with pie charts. And don't get me, by the way, don't get me started on 3D pie charts. But the underlying point to this is that, you know, huge amounts of evolutionary time taught our ancestors that if you see a small bear, it's less significant than if you see a big bear. And so any place where our brains immediately take over on size cues, they immediately take over on color cues, they immediately take over as far as figuring out what things that are going up consistently and things that are going down consistently. Good question. Any others? Okay, well, thank you so much. It's been a pleasure, and good luck.